Hey there! Well, yesterday I had fun on it was a podcast, and I got to join in, which was really kind of cool. I've never done that before. The guest speaker was somebody by the name of Paul Serwinek. I don't know if I'm saying that right, Serwinek. He is a director of the Christian Sociological Society. He is a retired researcher and consultant in the area of human resources, business ethics, and applied sociology, and serves as adjunct, probably said that wrong, professor at a number of Christian colleges in Michigan. So this is the guy that was the guest on this blog yesterday, and lots of topics were touched upon. Mostly he directed them himself, and it seemed to most of us that I at least am aware of who were listening, it seemed that his goal was to promote Christianity. So, whatever. But I got on, and they asked me how long, if I was an atheist, and I said yes, and told them I'd been an atheist for 3 years, and prior to that I'd been a Christian for over 30 years, and she asked me, well, what made you change? And I told her, well, I read the whole Bible, and I described, what I discovered in reading the whole Bible, and his comment was classic. He's like, well, we're of the New Testament. Christianity is all about the New Testament. You should only read the 4 Gospels. That's what he said. This is somebody who's a Christian and learned Christian, and he's telling me that my fundamental mistake, and what I should not have done as a Christian, was read the Word of God. So, oops, the Holy Bible's God's perfect word and inspired and all that. And he also said that the reason all the genocide happens in the Old Testament is because in the Old Testament those people were primitive and they viewed God differently than in the New Testament. It's actually not much, how much more primitive were they 3,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago than they were 2,000 years ago? I highly doubt they were that much more primitive. And how much is God's nature going to change just because of, how do you explain the way people look at God as an explanation for how God's nature changes in the Bible? Did the guys in the who wrote the Old Testament, did they just have a grudge against God and made up a bunch of bad stories about him just because they had a grudge? Or did he really commit those genocides? And if so, then how do we know that those writers of the Old Testament didn't actually understate the genocide and horrible things that the God of the Old Testament, which I guess is also the God of the New Testament, but we're supposed to forget the Old Testament because the Christian faith is based on the New Testament, and the Old Testament he actually said we're supposed to forget about that. We're moving forward, which is actually a very Mormon way of thinking. That's how the Mormons are. They'll say, well, forget about the fact that before 1978 we wouldn't let blacks be heads of the church because they're that cursed offshoot of whatever, the tribes of Abraham or whatever it is. And the Mormons believe that the more modern the prophet, the more valid his dictates are. The older prophets, the prophets of old, including Joseph Smith, are outdated compared to the new guy walking around driving the fancy car. So okay, I was really bad. I read the whole Bible, and that was my undoing, I guess. But what I have a hard time with is the whole attitude of we're just supposed to forget or just, not even dwell on the Old Testament. Well, yeah, because the guy in the Old Testament that's running things, the God of the Old Testament, is committing infanticide and genocide and ordering virgins to be raped and ordering human sacrifice. Not such a good guy. Again, I have to say, if Hitler had not committed suicide after all the atrocities he committed against the Jews, and if he had not committed suicide and they had caught him, and let's just say he they put him in prison and he's going to go to trial, but while he's in prison he becomes a Christian and he decides to turn over a new leaf, and he's going to be a good guy now, and he's going to help little old ladies across the street. He's changed his ways. Are we going to forgive Hitler for all the atrocities he committed against the Jews just because he wants to be a good guy now? He's going to be a good guy? Or what if he committed all these atrocities against the Jews, but he has a son, and his son is really, really, really good? So are we supposed to forgive Hitler because he has a son that's really, really good? I don't understand the mentality that Jesus makes up for all the horrible things that the God of the Old Testament commits against humans. Crimes against humanity. I mean, if you take every human dictator in history and you combine them together, they don't even compare to the atrocities that this God of the Christian God in the Old Testament commits. Except they don't want to call him their God because, you know, it's almost like they want to disown him because, ooh, he's not warm and fuzzy, and he's not merciful, and he's not forgiving, and you know, the one that they want to worship and stuff is this God of the New Testament that you know is represented by Jesus, and Jesus basically replaces the old God. You know, I'm sorry, I have a hard time forgiving this God, and he still exists. They're not saying that he's been replaced. They're just saying that, well, we focus more on Jesus, and we sweep the God of the Old Testament under the rug. We don't want to look at him. We don't want to look at what he did, because that's not the way things are now. That's because the people back then were primitive. So anyway, on the subject of the New Testament, I have a real problem with the New Testament. In fact, it was the New Testament that got me to the point where I wanted to discover I wanted to read the whole Bible, because, you know, I went along like every other Christian. You don't wake up in the morning one day and say, you know what, I think today I'm just not going to believe anymore. I'm going to be an atheist from now on. That is not how it happens. It is a gradual building up. And what happened for me was, you know, I was one of those people that I had this kind of idea in the back of my head what Christianity was, and it kind of was based on my own personal interpretation of what good and bad is. You know, very little to do with the Bible, or, you know, and it was when a friend pointed out to me some things in the Bible that I didn't know about, because you don't hear about these things in churches. And this is a rather classic one, if I can find it. It's in, there's so many sexist verses, I really have to scroll down. Oh, yeah. Okay, where it is. Oh, yeah, well, that's not either. Okay. All right. I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that's 1 Timothy 2, 9 through 15. First of all, we're ignoring the fact that when Adam was formed, Lilith was formed at the same time, and they were both formed out of dust. See, they want us to forget the parts that used to be in the Bible that aren't anymore. We're supposed to forget that Lilith ever existed. And to me, that's a huge, that really speaks volumes. That the fact that woman and man were both created from the dust, both at the same time, originally, has been taken out of the Bible. And what do we have in the Bible? We have verse after verse after verse of references about how women should be subjugate themselves to men. They should be in silence and with all subjection. You know, all these verses that command women to let men rule over them. Now, this is an Abrahamic-inspired religion that's an offshoot of Judaism. Funny thing, another Abrahamic-inspired religion that's an offshoot of Judaism is Islam. And Islam, you look at the countries in the Middle East that follow Islam and actually twist the religion in with their politics, and those countries have women dressed so you can't even see their skin or their faces. They aren't allowed to go out in public. If they even look at a man, or maybe a man of a different race, they could be stoned to death. If they fall in love with the wrong man, they could be stoned to death. A woman has to prove her innocence before she is considered innocent, whereas a man is considered innocent until he's proven guilty. Anyway, the more a religion is twisted in with politics, the more you see women being subjugated. Now here in America, we have just recently seen the rise of the religious right trying very hard to take over our government. And thank God that the no pun intended. Thank the flying spaghetti monster that they were all basically voted out of office, because these men, this mentality is just as rampant in Christians as it is in Islam. If you let them have their way, eventually you're going to have the same kind of treatment toward women. In the Christian world, the radical Christian, we're not talking about your every average ordinary Christian. We're talking about the radical Christians, like there are radical Muslims. There are radical Christians, and that's these guys that are saying that, well, if it's legitimate rape, well, maybe we could let a woman have an abortion. But if she just gets pregnant, she shouldn't be able to have an abortion. We should be able to take possession of her body for 9 months. She should lose her personhood and her say over what happens to her. And the whole attitude, you start letting women start giving their rights up. The next thing you know, they're going to say, well, women shouldn't really be allowed to vote because, technically they're under men, because men control their bodies when they're pregnant. This is why it was really upsetting to me when we were having the Romney-Obama election. It's like, are we really seriously? How many of these women are actually for these guys that are talking about taking our rights away? So anyway, the New Testament, seeing all these sexist verses about women, and I could read them. There's so many. But it's easy. Just Google sexism in the Bible and you will see them for yourself. Or sexism in the New Testament. There you go. You'll see all these verses. It was that got me concerned. Well, gee, is the whole Bible true? What parts of the Bible are inspired by God, and what parts of the Bible are there because there was an agenda going on by men to control their women and put women in their place? And then when you start doing that and you start going, okay, well, what parts of the Bible are of God and what parts of the Bible are of human, agenda, then you start mistrusting everything of the Bible, because how do you know? And then if you read about how the Bible was put together and that there were 16 Gospels that were rejected, that, were written by supposed people who walked and talked with supposedly the historical Jesus, that were rejected, like the book of Peter, with the little hopping wooden cross. And who decided that those 16 Gospels were less valid than the ones that we see in the Bible? Who decided that we should take the story of Lilith out of the Bible completely? That the women shouldn't know that the original woman was made at the same time as man out of the dust, not from his rib. If you read the first book of Genesis, it describes women and man being made from the dust at the same time. It doesn't really say Lilith, because most of the details about Lilith's story have been removed from the Bible, but it does still say that woman and man were made from the dust at the same time in Genesis 1. If you read Genesis 2, we get to read about Eve being made out of the rib of Adam, and she was made in his image, whereas Adam was made in God's image, and that's why man should have authority over woman, among other reasons. So anyway, this is getting really long, so I'm going to end it. I'm just saying that it was the New Testament that made me start to really question this belief and question, why would God deliberately make half the human race to be inferior than the other half, putting them at the mercy of the authority of the other half, And look at how Islam treats their women, as far as... And the fact that we just saw similar mentality starting to try to work its way into our government, just in the last year. And to me, they're all the same. I don't see really any difference between Christianity and Islam. They're both offshoots of Judaism. They both have the Old Testament. They both have, in my opinion, they have just as much, they have the similar attitude toward women. They both say stone, people for ridiculous crimes. Anyway, I read the whole Bible and now I'm an atheist. And I have heard so many atheists who used to be Christians say that same thing. And you know what's funny is I read the whole Bible. It was because I didn't want to lose my faith. I was rather shaken up when I read these really sexist verses that I had not known about, that the God that I loved, that I thought loved me, would allow this kind of message, or inspire this kind of message toward women. And so it was basically my going back and trying to find strength in my faith. That it wasn't that I was trying to go back and read the whole Bible and find out more reasons to dislike Christianity. I wanted to basically revive the strength, because it was a real stumbling block finding out that the God that I worship thought of me as less than a man. So I read the whole Bible. That's when I got to read about all the atrocities that this God commits. And basically don't even get me going. Let's just say that it's not a good book in my opinion. I find it very offensive. You can read the Bible, it's hard to find a page in the Old Testament that isn't describing murder, genocide, infanticide, or women being treated like shit, or raped, or whatever. So, and then there's another thing. I wasn't going to really get into this, but why not? There's a thing in here about the contradictions of the four Gospels. And, okay, so if we're only supposed to, as Christians, look at the four Gospels, what about the contradictions? I'm just going to play this. This is long, so I'm just going to make it even longer, okay? But this is a video I found on YouTube, Gospel Events. It's only part 1, but I'm only going to play part 1.
We'll notice throughout the rest of the video. For one, there's a lot of contradictions between the different accounts of the Gospels. Other times, an event in one Gospel isn't even backed up by the other Gospels. Now, outside the Gospels, we find that, of course, there's almost no historical documents describing the events that supposedly took place. Some of these events in the Gospels are so huge that you'd expect someone to actually mention it outside the Gospels. However, that never happens. Another thing that I will point out is when a Gospel writer is obviously trying to give the appearance of a fulfilled prophecy, but also fails at it, being that the event is either inconsistent with the other Gospels or not backed up by historical evidence. So, now that I've explained all this, let's get to those Gospels. So first of all, we have Jesus' genealogy. There are two versions of this, one in Matt chapter 1, the other in Luke chapter 3. If you read these, you'll find that they are completely contradictory. The common fundamentalist
This is annoying.
response to this is that one describes Mary's lineage, the other describes Joseph's lineage. But if we were to actually read the Bible, both claim that they are describing Jesus' lineage from Joseph. Now, if the Gospel writers didn't know for sure what Jesus' genealogy was, why did they even write it down? Well, because there's a prophecy that says Jesus should be descended from David. So, the Gospel writer, without any genealogy for Jesus or any evidence of Jesus' relationship to David, he decided to invent one. Now, it's possible that one Gospel writer had the correct genealogy and the other didn't, but that still means one is wrong, and that particular one is willing to completely fabricate something to give the appearance of a fulfilled prophecy. It should also be noted that neither the Gospel of John or the Gospel of Mark try to back up either Luke or Matt on this particular subject. Next in line, the virgin birth. Again, this is a subject mentioned only in the Gospel of Matt and Luke, so the Gospel of John and Mark don't back this up. But even if they did, this event is still physically impossible. In our day and age, we know that such things do not happen. However, back then, people were much more likely to believe it, being that they believed in supernatural events. What should also be noted is that this event is supposed to be fulfilling a prophecy. However, in the prophecy that it cites, most historians and linguists agree that the word used is not virgin, but instead young woman. So in this case, we find that instead of actually fulfilling the prophecy that was written down, the gospel writers try to give the appearance of their interpretation of the prophecy being fulfilled. Does that sound like the gospel writers are trying to fabricate an event to you? It does so to me. Event number 3, Jesus goes to Egypt. Unfortunately, this event is only mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew. The other 3 Gospels decide not to back Matthew up on this. And as
I have to interject. I don't know what the hell is wrong with my computer. It's really slow and it keeps stopping, and I just have to apologize. It's not usually this stupid, but I also have a machine that's about a little laptop that's like 3 years old, so you know it's on its last legs.
As far as details go, the entire trip is summed up into 2 or 3 verses, and the entire trip back is summed up in another 2 or 3 verses. Details of this event are surprisingly lacking. Now, what we have is an event with almost no details that is not backed up by the other 3 Gospels. Why is Matthew even mentioning this thing? Well, instead of interpreting the book of Hosea chapter 11 verse 1 as a reference to the Exodus, the gospel writer who wrote Matthew decided to instead interpret that as a prophecy about Jesus. So he decided to fabricate an event to make it look like Jesus fulfilled a prophecy. The 4th event that we're going to look at is known as the massacre of the innocents. It is described only in the Gospel of Matthew and not backed up in any way, shape, or form by the other 3 Gospels. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Herod, the Roman governor of that part of the Roman Empire at that time, is supposedly so distressed by Jesus' birth that he goes to Bethlehem and kills every infant in the town to try to get rid of Jesus. Neither Herod, any of his commanders, or any historian make any mention of this in their journals or in their writings. Due to there being no evidence of it, most historians think that this event never took place. So, with no evidence of this event taking place, and not being backed up by the other 3 Gospels, why did Matthew mention this event too? Well, would you be surprised to hear that there's a prophecy for this one? That's right, another fabricated event to give the appearance of another fulfilled prophecy. The 5th thing that I'm going to talk about is not limited to only one event. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus supposedly heals many people of their sicknesses. This actually does occur in all 4 Gospels. Many mythologies have this idea of a prophet or a man of God healing the sick. The Gospels aren't alone in this. The fact still remains that the healing of the sick simply by touching them or praying about them has never been known to heal them. This event can simply be disregarded on the grounds that it is physically impossible. But the fact that it is physically impossible set aside, there's still the idea that there's a man walking around Israel who can heal the blind and the sick. And this does not get written down anywhere. The only reference we have to this would be these Gospels that were written decades after the events they described. So you'd expect various sources to be documenting this. You'd expect many contemporaneous individuals to write down that they saw a man heal the sick by touching them. However, that does not exist anywhere with the Jesus story. These are some events that are not backed up by history in any way. So you know what? Looking at the prophecies that say heal the sick, and looking at the way that the gospel writers are more than willing to lie to make their gospels look like they're more mythical and more divinely inspired, I'd say that this is most likely also fabricated. The 6th thing that we're going to look at is the Sadducees and the Pharisees. These are 2 groups of people that throughout the Gospels contested Jesus and saying, hey, perform miracles for us. And yet, Jesus was surprisingly incapable of doing so when he was in front of these individuals. Now, we wouldn't expect the Sadducees and the Pharisees to write down and document a man that they believe is just another crazy man who believes he talks to God. But it's interesting because at some parts of the Gospels, you have Jesus perfectly willing to grant the wishes of people who come to him and to heal them and to perform miracles. And yet, at the same time, when these groups of people come up to him, he does not. It's something worth mentioning and looking at simply because it's just so strange. Number 8. Jesus rides to Jerusalem on a donkey. This is mentioned in the Gospels of Matt, Mark, and Luke, and it's supposed to be the fulfillment of a prophecy. Given how well the other prophecy fulfillments went, I think we can guess how this is going to go. The accounts given in the 3 Gospels do contradict each other. Luke does not mention where the donkey is found. However, Mark says that the donkey is found where 2 ways meet. That would be an intersection. And Matthew says that the animals, in Matthew there are 2 animals, which would be a major contradiction, are found in a straight way. Now, the actual prophecy says, "Your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." So in this case, we find that the 3 Gospels try to fulfill a prophecy. However, when you have 3 people independently fabricating an event, their descriptions are going to be quite different. We'd expect that. Number 9. Here's another noteworthy event that should be mentioned.
That hurt. Okay, well, I'm going to stop this because
Jesus gets tempted.
This is really getting long. But yeah, this is called Gospel Events Debunked Part 1. There's also Part 2 if anybody wants to hear. So my point is for this guy to tell me, well, you should only be reading the 4 Gospels. You shouldn't read the whole Bible. The 4 Gospels are incredibly erroneous and they contradict each other. They get the facts wrong. They make up stuff to try to make them seem like they are answered prophecies from the Old Testament. I don't think the New Testament is really something that I can believe. So anyway, read the Bible, Christians. Find out what it is that you believe and put your faith in without question. Because you know what? You only get one life, and it just seems like a waste to me to spend your life in false hopes and delusion.